The 70-ton King Tiger sat hull down at the edge of Cagny with its gun traversed northwest, and every man inside it had reason to believe he would survive the afternoon. 150 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor across the glacis plate. A 88 millimeter KWK 43 that could kill anything the Allies owned at 2,000 meters. The crew had watched the carpet bombing roll across the horizon that morning. Operation Goodwood, July 18, 1944, and they had survived it. Shermans advanced across the open wheat fields south of Caen in loose formation, dozens of them, and from inside the Tiger's optics they looked like what they were, 33-ton medium tanks throwing 75 millimeter rounds that could not penetrate the King Tiger's front plate at any range the gunner cared to test. The arithmetic favored the Germans completely. It should have been a turkey shoot running one direction only. Instead, one of those Shermans killed them. A single crew from the 2nd Irish Guards, 2nd Armored Battalion, firing a gun that had no business penetrating that armor, put 4 rounds into the same spot on the hull front in roughly 90 seconds. The King Tiger brewed up. The crew, those who survived, bailed out of a machine that doctrine, metallurgy, and 6 inches of case-hardened steel all promised would protect them. What went wrong was a collision of metallurgical failure, British gunnery training, and one lieutenant whose name the after-action report records, but whose thinking it does not. The report gives us the result. The method we have to reconstruct from what the 75 millimeter M61 APC round could physically do to face-hardened armor plate when concentrated on a single point, and what it could do defied what both sides believed possible. If this is the kind of breakdown you want more of, the engineering behind moments that shouldn't have worked, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments whether you think this kill was skill, luck, or something the manuals just hadn't caught up to yet. To understand why 4 hits in 90 seconds mattered more than 4 hits spread across the plate, you have to understand what German armor actually did when a round struck it. The King Tiger's front hull, the upper glacis, ran 150 millimeters thick, sloped at 50 degrees from vertical. Against a standard American 75 millimeter APC round, that geometry produced an effective thickness north of 230 millimeters. The penetration tables for the M61 gave it roughly 90 millimeters at 500 yards against homogeneous plate at 0 obliquity. On paper, the Sherman's gun couldn't get through at any range, not even point blank. The German crew knew this. Every tanker on the Western Front knew this. Tiger crews had absorbed hits from 75 millimeter Shermans dozens of times by July 1944, and the after-action routine amounted to counting the scars on the paint and continuing the advance. One German tank commander from the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion described the sound of a 75 striking frontal armor as like someone throwing a stone at a cathedral door. His word, cathedrala. The confidence ran that deep. But confidence built on penetration tables assumes each impact hits virgin plate, that the steel's crystalline structure remains intact between strikes, and that the crew inside has time to relocate between rounds. The lieutenant in the Sherman violated all of those assumptions in under 2 minutes. Here is what happens to face-hardened armor when the same patch takes repeated non-penetrating hits. The first round doesn't go through. It mushrooms against the surface, leaves a shallow crater, and sends a shockwave through the plate that propagates microfractures in the hardened face layer. The crew inside hears a tremendous bang, feels the hull shudder, checks their instruments, and carries on. The second round hits the same crater. Now the fractured face layer begins to spall. Chunks of steel blow off the interior surface at fragment velocity, bouncing around the fighting compartment. The armor hasn't been penetrated in any formal sense. No hole exists. But the crew is now dealing with metal shrapnel inside their own tank. The third round deepens the crater, collapses the weakened face layer entirely at that point, and exposes the softer backing plate underneath. Plate rated for far less resistance than the composite hole. The fourth round went through, 90 seconds start to finish. 4 impacts, same point, and a tank that cost the Reich 300,000 Reichsmarks and 8 months of factory time burned in a Norman wheat field because one Sherman gunner kept his reticle locked on the same square foot of steel while return fire cracked past his turret. The King Tiger's crew expected invincibility. The penetration tables promised it. The steel itself betrayed the promise under conditions nobody in German ordnance had wargamed, because nobody assumed an enemy gunner would be precise enough, fast enough, or crazy enough to do what this one did. 90 millimeters. That figure governed every engagement between a 75 millimeter Sherman and anything heavier than a Panzer IV. 90 millimeters of penetration at 500 yards, firing the M61 APC round with its hardened cap and ballistic windshield, striking flat plate at 0 degrees obliquity. The number came from Aberdeen Proving Ground tests conducted in 1943, and it traveled across the Atlantic in firing tables that every Sherman gunner carried folded in his breast pocket or taped to the turret wall. At 1,000 yards, the figure dropped to roughly 84 millimeters. At 1,500, 76. The numbers fell off a cliff beyond that, not because the round lost accuracy, but because the projectile bled velocity in the drag curve, and velocity is everything when steel meets steel. A round arriving 10% slower hits with roughly 20% less kinetic energy. Physics doesn't negotiate. Now set those numbers against the King Tiger, the Panzerkampfwagen 6. Ausführung B carried 150 millimeters on the upper glacis at 50 degrees from vertical. The turret mantlet ran between 100 and 85 millimeters thick, depending on where you measured. Henschel's manufacturing tolerances left some variation the blueprints don't acknowledge. The lower hull plate sat 100 millimeters thick at 50 degrees. The side hull ran 80 millimeters at 25 degrees, which sounds thinner until you calculate the effective thickness at combat angle and realize even a flank shot required the Sherman to close inside 600 yards with a clear line past the road wheels and skirt armor. The arithmetic left exactly one option: the rear plate, 60 millimeters thick, accessible only if the King Tiger's commander had somehow lost situational awareness entirely and let an enemy tank circle behind him in open terrain. In Normandy's hedgerow country, with engagement ranges often under 800 yards and sight lines chopped by bocage, orchards, and stone farm walls, getting behind a King Tiger meant driving past its gun. The survival rate for that maneuver does not require elaboration. British ordnance had run their own tests by mid-1944, using captured Tiger I frontal sections, not King Tiger plate, which they hadn't yet obtained. Their report, filed under WO 185/374, concluded that the 75 mm gun cannot be relied upon to defeat the Tiger's frontal armor at any range. The King Tiger's glacis ran 30 mm thicker than the Tiger ones. If the older tank already sat beyond the weapon's theoretical ceiling, the newer one occupied a different postal code entirely. British tank crews received this information through unit intelligence briefings that amounted to a single practical instruction: do not engage frontally, flank or withdraw, call in air support, wait for a 17-pounder. The 17-pounder could handle a King Tiger. Its APDS round, armor-piercing discarding sabot, punched through 230 millimeters at 500 yards, enough to contest the glacis if the shot placement landed clean. But Gorman's Sherman didn't carry a 17-pounder. The Irish Guards' Shermans at Goodwood mounted the standard 75 mm M3 gun, the same weapon fitted to every basic Sherman variant since North Africa. Gorman knew this. His gunner knew it. The loader feeding rounds into the breech knew it with his hands. Each M61 APC shell weighed about 14.5 pounds, and the brass casing came out hot enough to raise blisters if you caught it wrong against bare skin. Every man in that turret understood the ballistic gap between their weapon and the target's protection. The gap ran roughly 140 millimeters wide, the difference between what the round could penetrate and what it needed to penetrate. In practical terms, the 75 mm M3 gun could punch through roughly 39% of the armor protecting the King Tiger's front, nowhere near half. So why did Gorman's crew engage at all? The after-action report from the Irish Guards doesn't record deliberation. It records action, range, hits, result. The internal calculus stays invisible, but the tactical situation fills some of the silence. King Tigers from the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion had already knocked out multiple Shermans in the squadron that afternoon, and the wheat fields south of Cagny offered no defilade and no hull-down position, nothing that qualified as cover. Withdrawing meant reversing across open ground under the 88's optics. Sitting still meant waiting to die. The only move that changed the equation involved closing the range and firing, which also likely meant dying, but at least involved doing something about it. The M3 gun's breech could cycle a fresh round every 4 to 5 seconds in trained hands. The loader's rhythm set the tempo. Open breech, catch the spent casing, slam the next round home, slap the guard's shoulder, yell up. 4 rounds in 90 seconds, left time between shots, time spent watching the tracers strike and not penetrate, time spent choosing to fire again anyway. The Tiger was not a weapon of offense, it was a weapon of fear, our fear. General der Panzertruppe Friedrich von Mellenthin wrote that assessment in his FMS report for the U.S. Army Historical Division after the war, and the sentence landed with the quiet force of a confession. He meant the program. The entire lineage, Tiger 1, Tiger 2, the Jagdtiger, the Maus prototype that never left the factory yard. All of it grew from a single afternoon on the Eastern Front, when German tankers discovered their guns couldn't kill what they were shooting at. June 22, 1941. Barbarossa's opening day. Panzer IIIs and IVs rolled east, carrying 50mm and short 75mm guns that had crushed Poland and France without breaking a sweat. Then, they met the T-34. 26 tons, sloped armor at 60 degrees, a 76mm gun that punched clean through German frontal plate at ranges the Panzer III couldn't answer. The German rounds bounced, not metaphorically. Crews reported watching tracer trails deflect skyward off the T-34's glacis like sparks off an anvil. Within weeks, panzer commanders on the Central Front began filing identical requests up the chain. We need a heavier gun. We need thicker armor. We need it now. The T-34 shock, that's the accepted term among armor historians, and the Germans used their own version, T-34 shock, rewired German tank development overnight. Before June 1941, Wehrmacht doctrine treated tanks as mobile exploitation tools. Speed and mechanical reliability mattered. Strategic mobility, the ability to drive 200 kilometers on your own tracks without a breakdown, mattered more than any single engagement. The Panzer IV weighed 25 tons and could manage 300 kilometers on road before its running gear needed attention. That arithmetic won France in 6 weeks. After the T-34, the arithmetic changed. Or rather, German ordnance abandoned the arithmetic that worked and chased the arithmetic of the last engagement that terrified them. The Tiger one arrived in August 1942, weighing 57 tons. It carried the 88mm KWK-36, devastating, accurate, capable of killing anything the Allies fielded at the time. It also consumed 270 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers on road, roughly 5 times what a Panzer IV drank. Its Maybach HL-230 P45 engine generated 700 horsepower to move those 57 tons, which produced a power-to-weight ratio of 12.25 horsepower per ton. A Ford sedan did better. The transmission, Maybach Olvar, required a trained specialist to maintain and failed with grim regularity. Every Tiger battalion carried a dedicated recovery platoon, equipped with 3-ton half-tracks that could barely nudge the thing if it threw a track. The King Tiger doubled down on every one of those problems. 68 tons in combat configuration. The same Maybach engine, now hauling 11 more tons with 0 additional horsepower. Power to weight dropped below 10. Fuel consumption climbed to 480 liters per 100 kilometers cross-country, nearly 500 liters to travel 62 miles. A King Tiger company of 14 vehicles needed a fuel train that could have kept an entire Panzer IV battalion in the field for a week. The final drive units, the gearboxes connecting the transmission to the sprockets, lasted roughly 150 kilometers before failure. That number comes from the Henschel factory's own wartime maintenance reports, not from Allied propaganda. 150 kilometers, the distance from Cagny to Paris. German officers understood this. Major General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer-Lehr Division, told his American interrogators that heavy tanks ate the logistical capacity of units that needed it for fighting. The FMS files contain variations of this complaint from nearly every senior panzer officer who survived to write one. They knew the King Tiger consumed more than it contributed. They said so, on paper, to American officers holding clipboards in prisoner of war camps across Bavaria. The tactical invulnerability that made Gorman's kill so improbable came at a strategic cost that the Wehrmacht could not sustain, and its own generals openly resented. But the program continued because the fear never stopped. Every year brought a new Allied tank, the Churchill 7, the M26 Pershing, the IS-2, and every new threat triggered another round of armor escalation in Berlin. Krupp and Henschel competed for contracts that demanded thicker plate, bigger guns, heavier turrets, wider tracks. Nobody in the Waffenamt asked whether the bridges in Normandy could hold 70 tons, because the men writing requirements remembered 1941. They remembered rounds bouncing off T-34s. They built the King Tiger, not to win a war of movement, but to never feel that helplessness again. The machine sitting hull down at Cagny on July 18th carried the accumulated weight of 3 years of institutional panic cast in steel. Gorman's crew didn't know any of that. They saw a box they couldn't kill, and they drove toward it anyway. Montgomery sold Goodwood as a breakout. What 8th Corps actually got was an attritional grinder dressed in the language of exploitation. 3 armored divisions, the 11th, the Guards, and the 7th, would push south from the Orne bridgehead, through a corridor barely 3 miles wide, cross open farmland, and seize the Bourgabous Ridge, the high ground commanding the plains south of Caen. 1,500 tanks committed, the largest British armored operation of the war, and every yard of the approach lay under observation from German positions on that ridge, pre-registered by artillery and anti-tank guns that had occupied the same firing points for weeks. The corridor funneled armor like water through a pipe. The Germans didn't need to aim. They needed to wait. The carpet bombing came first, 2,600 Allied aircraft dropping 6,800 tons of ordnance along the corridor's flanks between 5:30 and 9 a.m. The scale defied comprehension. Crews in the leading Shermans reported the ground vibrating through their hull floors from 2 miles away, a low hum that climbed through the seats and into the jaw. Dust columns rose high enough to blot the sun across the entire eastern horizon. The assumption, Montgomery's, O'Connor's, the one baked into every line of the operations order, held that nothing under that carpet could survive to fight. The 21st Panzer Division, the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division, every gun position in the belt, all of it would be shattered or buried. The tanks would roll through a moonscape populated by dazed survivors. The assumption lasted roughly 40 minutes past H-hour. The bombing killed men and wrecked equipment in the forward zone, but the main German anti-tank belt sat south of the carpet's footprint on the reverse slope of Bourgabous Ridge. The 1688 mm guns of the 3rd Flak Corps, positioned around Cagny, Grentheville, and Soliers, never took a single bomb. Their crews watched the bombardment end, checked their sights, loaded their first rounds, and waited for the dust to settle enough to acquire targets. The killing ground opened at around 11 a.m., when the leading squadrons of the Fife and Forfar Yeomanry cleared the railway embankment south of Cagny and entered the open wheat fields. German gunners on the ridge could see for 3,000 meters in every direction. The Shermans advanced in formation across terrain, as flat as a billiard table, skylined against burning vehicles behind them, throwing rooster tails of dust that marked each tank like a signal flare. The 88s opened at 1,500 meters. The first volley knocked out 3 Shermans before any British tank had identified a firing position. Within 20 minutes, the Fife and Forfar lost a full squadron, roughly 15 tanks, and the survivors reversed into whatever shallow folds the ground offered, which in Norman wheat country meant depressions barely deep enough to hide the hull. One troop commander reported his tank rocking from near misses so consistently that his gunner couldn't hold the reticle steady enough to return aimed fire. The shockwaves alone disrupted gunnery at ranges where the 75 couldn't have penetrated anyway. The Irish Guards entered this corridor in the second wave. Gorman's squadron advanced south toward Cagny around noon, passing burning Shermans from the first wave at intervals of roughly 200 meters, wrecked vehicles marking the route like road signs, reading "Do not proceed." Ammunition cooking off inside dead tanks sent tracer rounds arcing sideways across the field at random intervals, a secondary hazard nobody had briefed. The turret crews kept their hatches cracked rather than buttoned because the interior temperature in a closed Sherman under July sun exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and a gunner fighting heat exhaustion can't track a target. So they rode with hatches open toward guns they couldn't answer, breathing diesel exhaust and wheat field dust, watching the smoke columns ahead, and doing the math every trained tanker does automatically. Range to target, muzzle velocity, armor thickness, probability of penetration. The math came back zero, every time. Against the 88s on the ridge and the King Tigers anchoring the German line around Cagny, the 75mm M3 gun produced a theoretical kill probability that rounded to nothing. The operations order didn't account for this because the operations order assumed the bombing would eliminate the guns. It hadn't. The Irish Guards War Diary for July 18th records the advance in clipped language that conveys more than any adjective could. Heavy fire from Cagny area, a squadron losing tanks steadily, no covered approach available. 11 words for a catastrophe unfolding in real time across 1,000 meters of open ground. Gorman's Sherman kept moving. The German doctrine called for engaging the lead and trail vehicles first to trap the column, and by early afternoon, the kill zone around Cagny functioned exactly as designed. Burning Shermans blocked forward movement, burning Shermans blocked retreat, and the 88s worked the middle of the formation with methodical precision. Somewhere in that middle, one Sherman turned its turret toward a King Tiger and opened fire with a gun that could not, by any published standard, hurt it. The Sherman's transmission had 5 forward gears and 1 reverse. The reverse topped out at roughly 2.5 miles per hour, walking speed for a man in no particular hurry. Forward 5th gear could push the tank to 25 miles per hour on hard ground, though the gyroscopic stabilizer on the 75 lost most of its utility above 15. The transmission itself, a controlled differential steering unit built by Detroit Transmission Division of General Motors, represented one of the quieter American engineering victories of the war. It almost never broke. German tankers nursed their Maybach gearboxes through every shift like surgeons handling wet glass, and the final drives on a King Tiger demanded replacement every 150 kilometers, regardless of combat stress. The Sherman's powertrain asked for oil changes and otherwise kept working. Tens of thousands of them rolled off the line with the same unit, and the failure rate stayed below 3% across all theaters through 1944. Reliability doesn't make headlines. It makes options. Gorman's gunner had put 4 rounds into the King Tiger in approximately 90 seconds. The Irish Guard's after-action report records hits, not ricochets, meaning the rounds struck and remained visible as impact scars or partial penetrations rather than deflecting entirely. 4 impacts concentrated on the same area of the turret ring junction, where the mantlet met the turret face. At the range Gorman's tank had closed to, sources vary between 200 and 300 yards. The M61 APC round carried enough energy to gouge steel, but not breach it. Each hit deepened the cavity left by the previous one. Whether the 4th round achieved partial penetration or merely spalled fragments off the interior face of the armor remains unclear. The records don't resolve it. What the records do confirm is that after the 4th round, the King Tiger's turret stopped traversing. The jammed turret changed the geometry. A King Tiger with a functioning turret controlled 360 degrees of threat. A King Tiger with a jammed turret controlled only the arc its hull faced. Gorman's driver, Lance Corporal James Barron, held the Sherman in fourth gear on a slight downward grade across stubble field, and Gorman gave the order that no armored warfare manual in any army's inventory had ever recommended as doctrine: ram it. Ballyrag it briefly. Irish Guards tank crews named their vehicles after Irish towns, a tradition running back to the regiment's formation of armored units in 1941. Ballyragget sits in County Kilkenny, a market town of a few hundred people on the River Nore, known for absolutely nothing military. The naming convention followed alphabetical assignment by troop and squadron. It carried no tactical significance, no symbolic weight. The crew didn't choose it. The quartermaster's list chose it. Back to the wheat field south of Cagny. Barron dropped the Sherman into fifth gear and covered roughly 200 yards of open ground in under 15 seconds. The King Tiger's hull gunner fired. The MG-34, mounted in the bow, sprayed tracer across the Sherman's front glacis, sparking off the cast armor without effect. Machine gun rounds against tank plate produced noise and nothing else. The 88 couldn't bear on a target that close and moving at an oblique angle to the hull. The King Tiger's driver attempted to pivot, but 68 tons don't pirouette. The Henschel steering system required 6 to 8 seconds to execute a full neutral turn on soft ground, and Barron didn't give him 3. Ballyragget struck the King Tiger's rear quarter at approximately 20 miles per hour. 33 tons of Sherman, hitting 68 tons of King Tiger, produced an impact that sheared the German tank's left side track off the rear sprocket and drove the hull sideways roughly 4 feet into the soft Norman soil. The collision buckled Ballyragget's front hull plate inward by several inches and jammed the driver's hatch shut. Barron's head struck the periscope housing hard enough to open a gash above his left eye. The Sherman's engine stalled on impact. The King Tiger's engine, already running rough on fuel that contained an increasing percentage of synthetic substitute, stalled too. Both tanks sat motionless, touching, in a wheat field full of smoke. The range between the two crews had dropped to 0. Crew bailed out of enemy tank almost immediately, the Irish Guards War Diary notes. 5 German tankers climbed out of a vehicle that could have withstood a direct hit from nearly any Allied tank gun in Normandy, abandoned it because a 33-ton opponent had physically collided with them at speed and jammed their turret and tracks simultaneously. The psychological contract broke. The King Tiger's armor promised invulnerability. Nobody had promised anything about being rammed by a lunatic in a medium tank. The German crew surrendered to Irish Guards infantry, moving up behind the armor. According to the battalion report, one of them required treatment for a broken collarbone, sustained during the collision. The rest walked to the prisoner collection point under their own power, past the burning Shermans their own gun had killed that afternoon. Barron's blood hit the turret floor in a pattern the loader had to step around to reach the ready rack. Gorman didn't wait for the medic. He ordered the crew out through the turret hatches. Barron's was jammed shut, so they hauled him up through the commander's hatch by his webbing straps, his head leaving a smear on the rim, and moved on foot across 200 meters of open field toward a Firefly from 3 Troop that had lost its commander to shrapnel 9 minutes earlier. The Firefly. Officially, the Sherman VC, a standard American M4 hull with the turret rebored to accept the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun, a weapon that had no American equivalent in Normandy and didn't need one because nothing else in the Allied inventory matched it. The 17-pounder fired a 76.2mm A PCBC round at 2,900 feet per second, 300 feet per second, faster than the American 76mm M1 gun, and in an entirely different universe from the 75 that Gorman had just emptied into a King Tiger's face without killing it. At 1,000 yards, the 17-pounder punched through 140 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. The King Tiger's turret side measured 80 millimeters, its hull side also 80. Frontal armor remained problematic even for the 17-pounder at range, but flanks and rear quarter fell inside the kill envelope with margin to spare. The Germans knew about the Firefly. They knew it mattered. Captured documents from the Panzer Lehr Division's tactical briefings in June 1944 contained specific instructions. Identify the Firefly by its longer barrel. Engage it first, before any other Sherman in the formation. The longer gun tube, roughly 40 inches longer than the 75's barrel, made the Firefly visible at distance, and British crews had started applying camouflage paint to the excess barrel length to disguise the difference. The counter-camouflage worked imperfectly. German gunners still picked them out by the muzzle blast, which threw a distinctive flat cone of flame rather than the rounder flash of the 75. One Firefly per troop of 4 Shermans. Kill that one, and the other 3 became annoyances rather than threats. The ratio tells you everything about Allied production priorities and their consequences. 3 tanks that couldn't penetrate heavy armor for everyone that could. Gorman climbed into a tank with a dead man's headset still warm in the turret basket. The Firefly's gunner, his name doesn't appear in the war diary, which records crews by vehicle call sign rather than individual name for 3 troops' losses that day, had survived and stayed at his position. Gorman gave him targets. The 17-pounder's breech occupied so much of the Sherman turret that the loader worked in a space roughly 22 inches wide, feeding rounds past his own ribcage, and each firing concussion pressurized the turret interior hard enough to make the ears ring for 30 seconds afterward. The ventilation fan couldn't clear the propellant gas fast enough between rounds. By the 3rd shot, the crew breathed through a yellow haze that tasted of copper and burned paper. Gorman directed the Firefly back toward the German positions anchoring the Cagny defense. The first target, a Panzer IV dug in behind a hedgerow with only its turret exposed, took a single round through the mantlet at 800 yards. The APCBC punched clean through. No ricochet, no gouge, no prayer required. The Panzer IV brewed up in 4 seconds, ammunition cooking off in a column of orange flame visible from a mile away. Gorman traversed right. A second vehicle. The after-action report identifies it as either a Panzer IV or a Stu G3. The smoke made positive identification difficult. Received 2 rounds in the hull side. It burned. A 3rd armored vehicle attempted to reverse out of its firing position. The 17-pounder caught it during the turn, punching through the thinner rear plate. 3 kills in under 6 minutes, all from a chassis identical to the one Gorman had rammed a King Tiger with 30 minutes earlier. Same engine deck and tracks, same Detroit transmission differential. The gun made the difference, and the gun came from a Royal Ordnance factory in Nottingham. The American hull got it into position with mobility and mechanical reliability to spare. The British gun provided the velocity to end the conversation. Neither half worked without the other. The Firefly couldn't have existed without the Sherman assembly lines turning out hulls by the thousand, and the bare Sherman couldn't have killed what Gorman needed to kill. The Irish Guards War Diary records 4 confirmed armored kills for Gorman's borrowed Firefly that afternoon. The 4th target's designation is illegible in the surviving copy. Water damage to the page, according to the regimental archivist. Gorman kept the Firefly in action until the battalion consolidated its position south of Cagny at dusk. Barron received treatment at the regimental aid post and returned to duty within 48 hours. A bandage over his left eye and a headache he reportedly declined to discuss. The German tankers who fought at Caen on July 18th didn't lose because they missed. They lost because it didn't matter how many times they hit. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer-Lehr Division, told his American interrogators something after the war that cut closer to the nerve than any tactical complaint. According to his FMS report, number A902, filed with the U.S. Army Historical Division in 1946, Bayerlein described the effect of fighting Shermans not in terms of any single engagement, but as a condition, a weather system that never broke. If I destroyed 20 tanks, 30 came the next day. If I destroyed 30, 50 appeared. The Americans always had more. His word, immer, always. The interrogator underlined it. The crew that bailed out of the King Tiger at Cagny had killed Shermans all afternoon. Their gunner put rounds through British armor at ranges where the 75 couldn't answer. By any measure internal to that single engagement, the King Tiger performed exactly as Henschel and Krupp and the Waffenamt had designed it to perform. Hits that should have been lethal from lesser guns bounced off or cratered harmlessly. The main gun delivered killing fire at distance and held a position against superior numbers for hours. And then a Sherman rammed it. The crew surrendered, and the vehicle sat in a Norman wheat field, leaking hydraulic fluid, until a British recovery team winched it onto a transporter 4 days later. Gone. One of roughly 489 King Tigers produced across the entire war. The replacement pipeline for that single vehicle ran through the Henschel factory in Kassel, which built them at a peak rate of roughly 40 per month when the machine tools cooperated and the aluminum alloy shipments arrived on schedule, which by July 1944 they increasingly did not. Allied bombing of the Luna synthetic fuel complex had begun compressing every German production timeline simultaneously. A King Tiger lost at Cagny would not be replaced at Cagny. It would not be replaced in Normandy. It might be replaced somewhere on some front in 8 to 12 weeks if Kassel still stood. The Sherman that rammed it rolled off an American assembly line that produced them at a rate the German General Staff found literally incredible. 49,234 Shermans built between 1942 and 1945. The Chrysler-Detroit tank arsenal alone, one plant on the east side of Detroit, turned out roughly 21,000. Ballyraggett's replacement, if needed, sat in a depot in southern England, pre-positioned, fueled, armed, crewed by a trained replacement team, and ready to cross the Channel on 48 hours' notice. The logistics tail that fed Normandy's armored units treated individual Shermans as consumable items, like ammunition or rations. You used them. They broke or burned. You drew another. German tankers understood this asymmetry long before their generals admitted it in post-war interviews. The Trent Park transcripts, covert recordings of captured German officers held at a country estate north of London, contain conversations from as early as mid-1944 in which senior Wehrmacht officers discussed American production not as a tactical factor but as a psychological one. General Major Heinrich Eberbach, who commanded Panzergruppe West during Goodwood, appears in the transcripts describing the morale effect on his crews. They stopped celebrating kills. A destroyed Sherman carried no emotional weight because another appeared in its place, sometimes in the same position, within a day. The tactical victory evaporated before it could register as accomplishment. Eberbach used a phrase the British translators rendered as harvest without end. You cut the wheat, and it grew back overnight. Gorman's 4 rounds into the turret ring didn't appear in any German after-action report that survives. The King Tiger's loss at Cagny shows up as a single-line entry in the Heavy Tank Battalion's strength return. Vehicle struck off, cause listed as mechanical damage and crew capture. No further detail. The Germans didn't record it as remarkable. One more tank gone in a theater that 8 tanks faster than the Reich could build them. The crew's experience, the hammering impacts, the turret seizing, the insane collision, the scramble out of the hatches into British captivity, vanished into a bureaucratic ledger that tracked only numbers remaining. Gorman received the Military Cross. The citation mentions the action at Cagny in general terms without describing the ram. Baron received no decoration for driving a tank into a 68-ton obstacle at 20 miles per hour. The records note his return to duty, and nothing further until the Guards' Armored Division's advance into Belgium 6 weeks later, where Baron drove a different Sherman with a different name through a different set of towns that had never heard of Cagny. The King Tiger sat in a British ordnance evaluation yard for 3 months. Technicians measured the 4 impact craters on the turret ring, each one roughly 2 inches deep, overlapping, forming a pattern the size of a dinner plate. The metallurgical report noted stress fractures radiating from the impact site consistent with repeated strikes on pre-damaged armor. The turret traverse mechanism had seized due to deformation of the race ring, not penetration of the crew compartment. Gorman's gunner hadn't punched through the armor. He'd bent the door frame until the door couldn't open. The 75mm gun couldn't kill a King Tiger. Nobody argues otherwise, but the crew behind it found a way to make the King Tiger kill itself. 489. That's the total production run of the King Tiger across roughly 20 months of manufacturing. Every last one assembled at the Henschel plant in Kassel under increasingly desperate conditions, with suspect steel alloys, by an exhausted workforce that included forced laborers who had every reason to sabotage the product. 489 tanks to fight a war on two fronts against enemies who measured their own armor production in five-digit figures. The Americans alone built more Shermans in March of 1944 than Germany built King Tigers in the entire war. One of those 489 sits today on a concrete pad in La Glaise, Belgium, a village in the Amblève River Valley, where Kampfgruppe Piper's spearhead finally ground to a halt during the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. The tank, a Henschel production turret variant, serial number and unit markings long since weathered off, rusts in the open air beside a small museum. Rain pools in the commander's cupola. The muzzle brake on the 88 has corroded to a rough orange texture that flakes onto the grass below. Bird droppings streak the mantlet. The tank sits approximately 11 miles from the fuel depot at Stavelot that Piper needed to reach and never did. Because American combat engineers blew the bridge, infantry held the riverbank, and artillery turned the approach road into a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Piper abandoned his King Tigers at La Glaise because they ran out of fuel. Not ammunition, fuel. The Ardennes offensive's entire operational logic depended on capturing Allied fuel dumps intact, a planning assumption so optimistic it bordered on clinical delusion. When the dumps didn't fall, the heaviest tanks in the German inventory became furniture. Piper's men drained fuel from knocked-out vehicles to keep a handful of Panthers moving and left the King Tigers where they stopped. American troops from the 30th Infantry Division and elements of the 82nd Airborne found them sitting in fields and farmyards with full ammunition racks and dry fuel tanks, their crews gone on foot through the snow toward German lines. The smell of a dead King Tiger is distinctive if you've read the recovery team's reports. Diesel fuel pooled under the engine deck, mixed with hydraulic fluid leaking from shot-up traverse mechanisms. The whole mess freezing and thawing in December, mud until it formed a black crust that stuck to boots and gloves. American ordnance teams who inspected the abandoned vehicles at La Glaise noted impact damage on several hulls, consistent with 75mm strikes. The same gun that couldn't kill a King Tiger at Cagny had contributed to mobility kills on King Tigers in the Ardennes by targeting tracks, road wheels, and engine ventilation grills. You didn't need to punch through 150mm of frontal armor if you could sever a track link and leave a 68-ton vehicle stranded on a road too narrow to bypass. The crews knew it. The American tank destroyers and Shermans that harassed Piper's column through the valley didn't try to fight the King Tiger on its own terms. They fought it on theirs. Shoot the tracks, block the road, fall back, repeat. Let logistics do the killing. The after-action report from the 30th Infantry Division's grueling fight along the northern shoulder uses a phrase that stuck. Describing the German armor's progressive immobilization, the report's author wrote that the enemy's heavy tanks ceased to be weapons and became obstacles. Their word, obstacles. A 70-ton weapon system reduced to a roadblock by the absence of fuel that American refineries pumped at a rate of 6 million barrels per day in 1944. Gorman's war didn't end at Cagny. The Guards Armored Division pushed through Belgium in September, crossed into the Netherlands for Market Garden, and fought through the winter into Germany itself. Baron drove. Different tank, different name on the hull. The alphabetical list had moved on. The 75mm gun remained the primary armament for most Sherman troops through the end of the war, and crews kept finding ways to make it work against armor it couldn't theoretically defeat, because the replacement depot kept sending 75s and the Germans kept sending targets. The King Tiger at La Glaise still sits on its pad. Tourists photograph it in summer. Children climb on the hull when their parents aren't watching, their sneakers scraping across armor plate that Krupp engineers calculated would resist any Allied projectile fired from any range on any axis. The steel held. The fuel lines didn't, and neither did the production numbers. The war didn't care what the penetration tables promised. 6 weeks after Cagny, Baron filed a routine maintenance request for his new Sherman's track tensioner. The form survives in the Guards Armored Division's logistics records, one sheet among thousands, dated August 29, 1944, stamped received, processed, completed. He signed it with his left hand. His right had a splint on 2 fingers from the collision he never got a medal for. The next morning, he drove east.